Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Charlene Margot, and I am founder of the Parent Education Series, now a program of nonprofit, the Parent Venture. We are absolutely delighted to have a very special film event for you tonight, My Body to Love, Dee's Story. And we have with us filmmaker Preeti Mankar Deb and Natasha Singh, a sexual literacy expert. I'll be telling you a little bit more about them in a minute, but again, we are just so delighted to have them both with us tonight. Please join me in a really warm welcome for Preeti and Natasha. So Preeti, we're going to start with you.
Thank you so much, Charlene. Thank you for that very warm introduction. I'm so thrilled to be here back with the Parent Venture and with Natasha Singh, who I met through the course of producing this project. So I'm very excited to be here. I'm just going to share my screen and give you a little background about the project. So the short film is part of a larger collection of shorts called the My Body to Love project. Charlene gave you a little introduction about me, and so I have been making short documentaries for the past 15 years, and really at this point my main focus is using these short films to capture personal stories, amplify diverse voices, crush stereotypes, and use these as kind of a catalyst to help fuel social change. I mean, all the research tells us that the power of the personal narrative and personal storytelling is deeper, more powerful, stronger than facts, figures, and research. And the two can go hand in hand to really, help create little ripples of social change. So before I talk more about the project, these are my two beautiful sons, Sean and Amo. They are 9 and 11. And like I assume, many of you on this call who are parents, the youth mental health crisis that hit us it rattled me. And I started thinking about what I can do to, use my films to start creating a difference. And all of my conversations with parents and young people and teachers led me to the My Body to Love project. So what the project is, we create these short documentaries, short personal stories, young adults talking about their own experiences of coming of age, bodies, contraception, sex, sexuality, and we engage with communities like at this event right here. And we hope that the power of these films and the conversations that follow help, create healthier youth in our communities. Essentially, these films will offer, valuable perspectives and solutions for adults seeking to support their growing teenagers. That is the main idea. All the research that we have shows us that open conversations about sex and sexuality, comprehensive sex ed, they have this whole range of benefits. A lot of parents shy away from talking about sex and sexuality because they believe that they might open this Pandora's box. But all the research shows that these conversations prevent sexual abuse, they prevent bullying, they help young people develop healthier relationships with themselves and with others, they delay sexual initiation, and they reduce unintended pregnancies, among other things. When I'm producing my films, I always look for organizations that have worked long and deep in this space. And I partner with, people who can. So these organizations that I've partnered with, Health Connected, Advocates for Youth, California Latinas for Reproductive Justice, they have helped me come in contact with the storytellers that I have profiled in the films. And they have helped me in, ensuring that the shaping of the narrative arc will create the social change that we desire. So I'm very grateful to these organizations, as well as to the Parent Venture, who is now a distribution partner. So, it's because of the power of these networks that we're able to make these films and bring them out into the world. The film that you will see tonight, Dee's Story, it's a part of a larger collection featuring 4 stories. We screened Arjun's story with the Parent Venture last month, and we will be sharing Katie's story in the new year. So just to give you a sense, these are the 4 stories, and they all deal with young people and sexuality in slightly different ways, very different ways. The films will be, we are projecting to have them on PBS in the new year. And we are also, as we work on the distribution, we are also working on subsequent episodes. but the main, these films are actually designed to be screened in community screenings like these. So if you are part of the audience and watch the film and like what you see, feel touched by it, then do get in touch, because I would be keen to come to your community to share the longer episode made up of 4 films. So yes, stay in touch. This is my information. My partner organization, Health Connected, has a website called Let's Talk that has resources on for parents looking to talk to their kids about sex and sexuality. And do subscribe to my newsletter so you can stay in the loop as new films and new episodes come out. With that, I will share the film D Story. I just have to stop sharing and then I will reshare the D Story with you.
Preeti, do you have any comments after showing that film? I just got chills when she said, "It's your body to love." That was just beautiful.
Yeah. I mean, really, D Story is not unusual. You know, many teenagers, I mean, when I look back in my own experience, you know, when you start thinking of, when you find yourself in that time and place where you are ready for sexual intimacy, there's often parents are not available to talk to, and that leads to a whole slew of issues and stresses. So I'm just so grateful that Dee shared her story in this honest and beautiful way. And also she's using her knowledge and her life to help educate others. So, you know, it's really a beautiful full circle.
It really was a beautiful story. Thank you, Preeti. And now we want to introduce again Natasha Singh, who is a sexual literacy and ethics educator. We really wanted these events, in addition to Preeti's beautiful films, to bring an educational component. And Natasha is very special in that way. So again, Natasha, welcome, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me. And I'm just going to set up my slide deck here. So just bear with me for 1 second. Okay, can everyone see this?
Looks perfect.
Thank you. All right. I also just, before I launch into this, I just wanted to thank the Parent Venture for extending this invitation to speak, and to Preeti especially for producing and creating such an important film. And I've had an opportunity to see some of Preeti's other films as well. And they're so important and so necessary because they really give young people an accurate reflection of themselves and their stories. So I'm truly inspired by that. And I think, and I hope some of what I'm going to say this evening will echo why it's so important for young people to be able to have adults in their lives, particularly their parents, to speak to about sex and sexual decision-making. I do want to start with some of the barriers that I often encounter. I do a lot of, I work with a lot of parents and school communities, and what I often hear from parents with regard to why they don't want to broach the subject of sex and sexual decision-making, I often hear parents saying, it will distract them if I talk about it. I've heard some parents say, if I broach this topic at all, they're going to run off and experiment with sex. I've heard parents say and express fears that talking about it will take away a young person's innocence. I've also had some parents say the kids these days know it all and they know everything already. I've definitely heard parents say it will corrupt my child. I've heard parents say it's against our culture, it's against our religion if we talk about this subject. And then, of course, I've heard parents say, I'm embarrassed, I'm awkward, I'm extremely uncomfortable. And I also happen to work a lot with teachers and faculty and administrators at a variety of schools. And what I'm hearing from faculty a lot are things like, it's not my job or part of my training to talk about this. I've heard faculty say, I don't want to cross a line and face angry parents. I've heard people say their parents or another teacher is supposed to teach them that, and essentially it's not my job. I've heard people say, faculty say, I don't have time for this topic. It's not really related to class content. And of course, faculty will say talking about the subject for some of them makes me very uncomfortable, or it makes my students uncomfortable. I've heard faculty say they seem to know everything already, or I've heard them say they're still innocent and I really don't want to push information on them. I've also heard faculty say, I'm afraid of saying the wrong thing and getting into trouble or causing harm. And then I also hear faculty say, I don't want to be told anything, I'll have to report. And so what we have here, when we just look at this list of comments on both sides in terms of parents and faculty, it means that a lot of young people are not, again, having the appropriate support that they need. And when I've polled students, and I do poll students across the country with regard to their perspectives on what makes it difficult to talk to their parents, I wanted to share with you tonight some of what I've heard from students based on their anonymous responses on these surveys. And so these are their quotes. I had a student say, my parents are like, which means my parents pretty much say, no sex till marriage, period, and no marriage till at least 27, and stay away from boys after X p.m., etc. I've heard students say, this student wrote, I'm not straight, and I have a partner of the same gender. So I think my parents don't know how to talk to me. This student wrote, embarrassment and shame, and the fact that I'm forbidden from having relationships in high school. This student wrote, my parents work really hard and I don't want to worry them. I've also had students say they would probably get mad if I tried to talk about that. Another student wrote, when I have tried talking to them, it feels like I'm turning myself in because they always assume the worst. And I'm hearing this more and more from students who say that they almost feel like criminals if they broach the subject at home, where they feel like their parents immediately assume guilt from them, or that they've done something bad or wrong. A lot of students of color write that their parents say to them, this is, or feel that this is a white person thing and therefore not relevant. And this student wrote, I often worry about hurting them or bringing up uncomfortable topics because of religion, philosophy, politics, etc. I also like to avoid conflict when possible. I am really struck by the absence of voices for working on behalf of young people and really supporting them. And I think it's not surprising then that we're also seeing students beginning to speak for themselves. Some of you, if you live in the Bay Area, may or may not recognize this campus. This is a picture of the Berkeley High campus. And what it shows here is a protest that students, and a walkout where students, just to give you a little backstory, students began writing down the names of people at their school who had perpetrated sexual harm, and they wrote them on the bathroom wall. And what happened is that list of names kept growing and growing. And students became frustrated and upset because they said to themselves and to one another, if this list of names is growing and everyone can see, why isn't anyone doing anything about it? And they took it upon themselves to organize this walkout. And I would say, arguably, because I work with a lot of schools who've staged at walkouts, and I work with student groups, this has become a template for a lot of schools where students are taking it upon themselves to demand safety at school, to demand more sexuality education, and to demand resources. And while I want to lift up student voices at the outset and champion student voices and say to you that I think it's laudable and wonderful that students are at the forefront of this kind of movement and agitating for change, it also saddens me deeply. Students should not have to bear this burden on their shoulders alone. We all have a responsibility to champion what I would like to call sexual ethics. We have that responsibility certainly as teachers and educators, and definitely parents as well. And, you know, one of the things when I work with students, I will often ask them from where I will ask them, do your parents, in what arenas are your parents communicating their positive hopes and expectations and values for you? And many students will say, Natasha, I know my parents' values and expectations in the realm of school and academics. And some students will say, my parents have already mapped out where I'm supposed to go to college. Other students will say, I know my parents' positive hopes and expectations in the realm of nutrition or sleep or homework, or how I should treat my siblings. But when I ask them, do you know your parents' positive hopes and values and expectations in the realm of sexuality or relationships, most students are silent. And I think that's in part because many of us who are worried about the safety of young people tend to lead with our negative hopes. So we often say, I hope you don't get raped. I hope you don't have sex. I hope you don't sexually harm someone else. And so we lead with a lot of negative hopes and expectations, but without positive hopes and values and our articulation of them, we don't leave young people with a lot to aspire to. So when I work with, say, 10th graders, I might walk into a room and say, I hope that when and if you are ready to engage sexually, that your experiences are pleasurable, that they're fun, that they're safe, that you feel respected, and that you have respected the other person, that you both have consented to this, and that you both have an experience or experiences that are pleasure positive and shame and regret free. And most students will look at me and their eyes will bug out a little and they'll say, wow, no adult has said this to me before. So I invite you and encourage you to really lead with positive hopes and expectations. And the reason that I think it's very important to communicate positive values and hopes is because if studies show that students who know their parents' values are more likely to make behavioral choices that are consistent with those values. And I would say that values can often be communicated indirectly and not just directly. And I'll give you an example. I come from a family where my parents had an arranged marriage. They knew each other, I think, for an hour before they got married, and they had a 52-year marriage. And during my childhood and adolescence, I never saw my parents engage in public displays of affection, never. But when I was about 15, my mother must have sensed that I was becoming sexually curious or active, and she took it upon herself to say to me one day, Natasha, I would like to talk to you about sex. And I thought, finally, my mother is going to say something useful in about the subject. And she took me to my room, closed the door, looked me up and down like this, and then wrinkled her nose as if she was smelling something funky in the air. And she said to me, Natasha, a girl is like a piece of chewing gum. Once she has been chewed, nobody will want her. And that was my sex education in a nutshell, because my mother didn't talk about sex after that at all. But I can tell you that that one phrase communicated volumes to me. It communicated to me that sex was shameful, that females or girls couldn't experience pleasure, and that if a girl did engage sexually, that she was garbage and that she was used goods. And I really had to work with that as a young person. I can also assure you that silence speaks volumes as well. So it's not just one phrase that can stay with a young person. It's that if we don't speak at all, students can make up what they think our silence means. And so it's very important to fill in that gap, because if we don't, culture will. And our culture, of course, we know that it's saturated with messages about body, about sex, about beauty. There's the mainstream pornography industry that are all working in a way to, whether we like it or not, or shape and inform attitudes and behaviors and beliefs about sex and sexuality and gender and power and relating. And I think what else also communicates values, of course, is our educational system. I happen to work in even though I work nationally, I can tell you I live in a state that is supposed to have some of the most progressive sex education in this country. But I can go to a variety of schools, even in the Bay Area, and find some schools are teaching sexuality education, others are not. Sometimes schools have sexuality education tethered to the comfort level of a teacher. So even in the same school, students can work with one teacher who's super comfortable, and then the other section of that grade can work with another teacher who's very uncomfortable. So even in the same school, you can have students getting uneven experiences of sexuality education. Oftentimes, we still put sex ed in the hands of biology teachers or phys ed teachers as if they have some secret special knowledge to impart about sex. And I would say that who's teaching this education matters, because if you have it only in the hands of biology teachers or phys ed teachers, it may communicate that sexuality is just about parts and functions. And we know that it's not. We know that there's an emotional side, there's an emotional component to navigating relationships, sexual intimacy, and 70% of young people ages 16 to 24 say they wish someone had talked to them or they'd known more about the emotional side of sex before their first sexual encounters. I would also say that we tend to focus a lot on unwanted pregnancy, STIs, sexually transmitted infections, refusal strategies, danger, and there tends to be very little to no emphasis on pleasure. And I was working recently with a school, and I was doing a parent ed night, and I said to parents, why do you think there's such little emphasis on pleasure? And a parent put up her hand and said, I know, if I talked to my son about how pleasurable sex could be, he would go off and experiment. And several parents also nodded and said, yes, I know that's what would happen. And I'm here to tell you that studies show that that's actually what doesn't happen. And I'd like you to consider a sort of a logical parallel I'm going to make here. When we teach young people about fire safety in this country, and by the way, we spend more time on fire safety on average than we do teaching about sex ed. But when we teach young people about fire safety, they learn how to stay safe in the case of a fire. They learn what to do to protect themselves. They learn to be cautious. They don't run home and try to set your house on fire. Similarly, when we teach young people about sex ed and we teach them in age-appropriate and developmentally appropriate ways, they are less likely to engage in risky behavior. And it has a lot of positive effects, which I'll talk about shortly. I would also say this, that if we only talk about sexuality in terms of fear and shame, what we will do is that we will raise young people to have very low standards for their sexual experiences. Do we not want to raise standards? Should people not have high standards for their first sexual experiences and all of their sexual experiences? So it's really important to acknowledge the possibility of pleasure. And I think these statistics here also speak for themselves. Only 17 states require sex ed to be medically accurate. And I can go on, and there's a ton of research out there about the state of sex education in this country. I would say even if your child is getting what you might consider a progressive sexuality education, they are bound to go to a high school or college where they've met people who've had little to no sexuality education at all. If you were in front of me and this was live, I would ask you, which country among developed countries do you think is doing the worst job with sex ed? And I'd love to hear your responses, but I will tell you, it is in fact the United States. And the way that we know that is through what are called sexual health outcomes. So in the US, young people, they make up about 27% of the population, but acquire a little over 50% of newly acquired sexually transmitted infections. We also in this country have one of the highest rates of teen pregnancies. In terms of which country is doing it the best, it's actually the Netherlands. And the age at which they start sexuality education is in fact 4. Now, when I share that information with American audiences, most of the time, people's eyes bug out of their heads and their jaws drop. And I suspect it's because most Americans picture a creepy adult coming into a room, gathering a bunch of 4-year-olds and talking to them about the act of sex. And I would say that's because we have a very, very narrow conception of what sexuality education is. In the Netherlands, they may start at age 4 talking about the names of the body parts. They may teach what we call body literacy. They also might teach about emotional literacy and help young people figure out and name different kinds of emotions. They might work with young people on consent and navigating boundaries and preferences and learning how to communicate. Here in the US, for instance, what we might do when we're teaching about the body is we might say to a young person, these are your eyes, this is your nose, this is your mouth, these are your toes. In the Netherlands, people might teach young people, these are your eyes, this is your nose, this is your mouth, this is your penis or vulva, these are your toes. What's the difference? It's just a body part. And the more young people can reduce, the more we can reduce stigma about our bodies, about talking about our bodies, the more we can have ease and communicate. And when we have ease and a capacity to have literacy around our bodies and our feelings, we're better able to advocate for ourselves. And when we think about sexuality education in the Netherlands, we have positive sexual health outcomes as well. Only Dutch teens account for only 10% of all sexually transmitted infections and have one of the lowest rates of teen pregnancies in the world. And unlike their American counterparts, most Dutch adolescents say that their first sexual experiences were enjoyable and consensual. They also report higher rates of communication and sexual satisfaction. And I think the positive news is for parents who are still on the fence or who are frightened about talking about these things with their child, I can assure you, not just based on personal anecdotes and my own research, but I can tell you that studies show that, number one, students say that their parents are their primary influences on their decisions about sex. And significantly, when parents talk openly with their child about sexuality, those children are more likely to have later sexual debuts. And all that means is that it means that your child is less likely to engage in sex earlier. That the date and the time is actually later when you have age-appropriate conversations and developmentally appropriate conversations with your child. Your child is less likely to take risks and have fewer sexual partners. They engage in less risky behavior. So there's all sorts of positive outcomes to having conversations with your child. And I would say to parents, a lot of the time parents will say, Natasha, I don't really know where to start. I would say that in this country, we tend to, again, have a narrow perception of sexuality education. We tend to think it should just be about sexual health and reproduction. I say, and this list of circles that you see here is nowhere near finite. There are many other circles I would add to the circles of sexuality, but I would say that there's so many avenues with which to talk about sex. And we can talk about power and agency and values and ethics in all of these different arenas. We can talk about sexual harassment. We can talk about media. We can talk to our kids about what sorts of messaging we're seeing about bodies or sexuality or dating or relationships, whether they're in relationships or not. We can talk about the body image, the sexual response cycle. We can definitely talk about intimacy, risk-taking, how to figure out whether to take a risk, caring and sharing, how to express affection, how to deal with rejection. We can talk about sexual identity, gender, what it is to be in a brown and Black body, what it is to be in a body that's differently abled or a body that's a different size. All of these things have effects on how we communicate and how we show up in our bodies. These are all really helpful avenues and important pathways. So I like to say to parents, if you're uncomfortable with one arena, grab another. The important thing is that you are engaging in open communication and conversations and that you're a parent that is approachable. And finally, I just wanted to end by saying that I want to end on young people's voices and lift those up, because I've asked young people what would make it easier to talk to your parents. And a lot of students have said, I would just be thrilled if my parents didn't give me a lecture and they just listened. Parents have written them not having a big reaction and instead just helping me out. Students have written for them to not make me feel like I'm a bad person if I have a question. And this student wrote, what would make it easier is if parents just had education, and if we in our field could let it be known that it is really okay to talk about these topics and that it actually helps. And so I'm going to close here and I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'll invite both Charlene and Preeti back for a Q&A. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Natasha. That was really wonderful. We have parents writing in the chat saying, finally, a real talk.
Oh.
I am half Canadian, and my immigrant mother had 5 babies in 10 years, but never used the word pregnant in our house because it wasn't polite. Yeah. So I think I'd like to just start by saying to both of you, Natasha, you shared a bit of this, but what got you both interested in making this really an important part of your professional career, educating parents, families, kids about sexuality? And why in the world do we equate sex and relationships with dare, like just say no?
Preeti, do you want to take that one and I'll jump in afterwards?
Yeah, for me, really, after the Dobbs decision last year, I really felt compelled to do something in the reproductive rights space. And I was coming from the space of, I want to make a film about abortion rights. That was what I really wanted to do. And as I started talking to, now they've become many of my nonprofit partners or consultants, I started talking about this idea that I want to kind of help shift the narrative. And, in America, I started realizing that if we want to reduce, we a lot of people were coming to it as, wanting, who were opposing this, came from this perspective of, we don't want women to have unintended pregnancies, and if they have unintended pregnancies, they should go through with it. And then I started realizing that if we're talking about unintended pregnancies, we need to talk about sex and sexuality and sex education. And as I started talking to parents and young people, I had this realization that, it's sex education is the foundation of, body autonomy, because it's only when we teach, we have these open, healthy conversations about bodies, about contraception, about people, that we can begin to tackle the stigma that exists. And that is what will help us be healthier, that will reduce unintended pregnancies, and also understand the need for abortion rights, and body rights. So that's how I came into this space. And what started as wanting to talk about reproductive rights, really, I became focused on sex ed, comprehensive sex ed, conversations about sex and sexuality. And I realized the deep impact this has with the mental health of our young people.
Absolutely. Thank you, Preeti. And Natasha, we in this program have been educating around sexuality, gender for close to 2 decades, but your perspective as a sexual literacy and ethics educator is very different. So maybe you could tell us again more about that and what got you here.
Sure. I mean, I've always been interested in these kinds of issues ever since I can remember. I would say I found that I was at a school where a young person was assaulted by an adult in the community, and this was way before the Me Too movement. And what really troubled me was the ways in which adults talked about it. There was so much blaming of this young person and this minor, and a lot of protection. People really wanted to protect the school. And I was looking around and thinking, this is so tragic that young people are getting these kinds of messages, that what matters more is a reputation of a school, and their voices are being negated and their experiences are being negated. And I also saw parents and faculty who cared being really at a loss for how to broach the topic. And so I really wanted to I was teaching about gender and literature and all those other things at the time, and decided that it was time to really focus exclusively on this topic of sexual ethics. But I wanted to have a different kind of approach, because oftentimes when sex ed is taught, and I think a lot of parents can vouch for this, you have an educator come in and they just talk to a room full of students, and then nobody knows what was said. And my commitment is that faculty, administrators, parents, and young people all have the same tools, language, and framework, so that we can start talking to each other. And so my approach is really rooted in community engagement and community transformation, because we all need to start talking to one another. And so I would say that really, what I saw in that community, the need that I saw, really highlighted for me what the gaps were and what's needed in our larger culture. So that's why I got into this.
Okay, thank you. And one of the things that I think Dee's story points out so beautifully, Preeti, is that as a bicultural or biracial young woman, there was a conflict between these two cultures, both of whom were reticent to talk about sex. So I'd like to hear from both of you how you think culture plays into this issue and what we should be doing about it.
I think culture is such a big part of this, and as Natasha was saying, those the parents talking about it. It's embarrassing. I don't want my kids to experiment. These are one of the students said, my parents think these are white people's problems. Within the South Asian community, I hear that all the time. The last film that we shared, which was a South Asian story, it was obvious, the young boy, the main character, Arjun, who's gay, his mother kept thinking that, oh, there are no gay people in my family, so it's unlikely my son will be gay. And I think that it's important to have representation, which is happening now in the media. There are more, people of color being shown as being, in these ways, sexually active, LGBTQ, and it's important for communities to understand that these are issues that touch their children as well. A lot of times the immigrant communities feel like, our kids are focused on doing well and, being high achievers academically, or they feel like, or in Dee's case, her family felt like, you've seen other people around you get pregnant, so just don't have sex, just don't let it derail you. And I think we need to change those conversations. So yes, Natasha, this is Natasha's field, so she can speak more about it. But I think it's important for us to really have representation so that different people, communities of color, start to feel that this is happening within their communities and for their children as well.
Yeah, I really appreciate those remarks, Preeti. And I think I'd like to kind of play with the word culture, because I think there's culture related to region and ethnicity, and place. And then there's also family cultures and traditions that we have. And then there's cultures of silence. And, I certainly know with a lot of immigrant communities that I work with, some of the words that I highlighted are things that I hear all the time. And what really makes me sad is a lot of times kids will also say, we just don't talk about this in my family. This is just totally taboo. And I think that, again, there's probably a confluence of cultural beliefs that this is something that doesn't happen in our community. Then that's compounded by a culture of silence and a culture of denial, and a collective sort of agreement that we don't talk about this. And I think that when young people are growing up and they're going to school, they're going to be meeting people of all different backgrounds, from all different communities, and they are affected by that. And when they go home, what we don't want to have is them not being able to talk to their parents because it's the family culture is to not talk about it. It's really, really key to break some of those taboos. And I think what Dee's story really highlighted is that if you can't go to your parents, you'll hide it. She was going to somebody's house, when she was in the 9th grade and engaging in a relationship she later identified as not being very healthy for her. Again, if we deny it, it's so important for parents to look at those potential consequences that come from culture and cultures of silence that push young people underground. And often when they're there, they don't make very safe choices or self-honoring choices or choices that honor others.
Yeah, I also want to add to like cultures of silence, there's also cultures of shame. Shame is used as such a powerful tool to control. And I think as parents, we should all make a conscious decision to take shame out of parenting, and conversations and acceptance and really, calling out the elephants in the room is what is important. Like Natasha, what your mom said to you, it's not uncommon. It's not an uncommon story, which is what makes it so tragic. So I think, yes, I think shame also plays a big part in having these conversations with kids and, their framework for sexuality, gender, identity, all of these things that get influenced by those cultures.
It's interesting because when we've done this before, like for many years with Health Connected, great educators like Vanessa Kellum, and she would say to parents, even the most conservative, don't you want your child to grow up and have good relationships? And they would say, yes. And do you think sex should be part of that relationship? Well, yes. But should you talk about it? No. So there's a real disconnect, isn't there, between that? I mean, maybe we need to spend a little bit more time talking about that, as you say, Natasha, positive hopes for our children.
And I think value. Yes, go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, I think that the piece about values is really important because sometimes we get so caught up in the particulars of this should be taught, that shouldn't be taught. And we forget that what's really key is to really emphasize what are our family values. I think when I talk and teach about sexual ethics and sexual values, I'll say, emphasize that you think consent as a value is important, that reciprocity as a fundamental value is important, that honoring self and others as a value is important. If parents can really lift those up and learn to speak in that way, I think young people can have that as guidance in terms of how they show up in their relationships and sexual experiences.
Absolutely. Preeti, you were going to say?
No, I just agree 100%. And I guess I would like to ask Natasha, so if, coming from, if a family wants to preserve this idea that we don't want you to be sexually active as a teenager, we want to wait until you're an adult in a committed relationship, how do we communicate to families that it's important to share those values with their children, whatever they are, even if your value is not to have sex right now because you're too young, if that's what you feel, without alienating their children, or if you have any advice.
Yeah, I think what I'm about to say might sound a little paradoxical in a way. We all, even the most conservative parents who even describe themselves that way, they will all acknowledge that they're not 100% like their own parents, that there are some values that they have completely adopted and others they have totally rejected. And I think it takes some humility to understand that our children will not follow every single value that we have, but there are some that are really important to emphasize. And I think parents can say, my preference is that you wait. But I think, again, if you give kids choices and you really speak clearly to them and they understand why you think the way that you do, that might be helpful in delaying a first sexual experience. But if you come at it from a place of shame, blame, wrong, or control, it's actually inappropriate. I had a set of parents I was working with who were Orthodox Jewish, and they did not want their daughter to have sex until she was 25. And at some point I said, I understand these are not your family values. I understand you're heartbroken. And there's a line that can be inappropriate. If you can't control somebody's sexuality at that state, and we don't want to teach people that they're the subject of anybody's control in that realm. And so it's something for parents to parse out and think about. And I would also just say that even if parents are uncomfortable talking about these things, it's really okay to say to your child, I'm uncomfortable talking about this, but I'm so committed to your safety and well-being. And yes, I would love you to make great self-honoring choices. That's the best we can do.
So that's a good lead in. If you are uncomfortable, just admit it, right? Just say it.
Yes.
Okay. Because, for example, what advice would you have for talking to kids about sex when the family preferences that they don't have it at all, as Preeti said, until they're in a committed relationship? Is that reasonable if that's the family value?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's reasonable always to communicate your values. That's wonderful and reasonable. It's great for kids to know what their parents' values are. It's unreasonable to expect that your child is going to follow every single one of your values to the T the way that you want them to. I think that any parent knows that, and so again, it's great to communicate it. It's great to communicate why you feel the way you do and to leave space to choose. Nobody likes to be forced or pressured into anything. And so in terms of modeling that, I actually think that's a fundamental and important thing to model for young people, that here I'm telling you my values and I'm giving you space to choose, because that's about valuing, as Preeti invoked the term body autonomy or bodily autonomy earlier. That's a way of modeling that and championing that.
Yeah. So we have some really great questions coming in from the audience. Here's one. How can we help young people to develop relationship skills in a realistic and progressive time frame, in contrast to what is portrayed in online porn?
Well, I can tell you a lot of the work that I do with young people is on communication and asserting preferences and asserting boundaries. And what's shocking to me is I can work in schools that have great stellar academics, and still the majority of students will say, yes, I understand consent, but I really have difficulty expressing what I want and need. And so I think that starting with those skills and teaching those skills is really important. I also think that in this country, we need to do a much better job teaching and talking about consent. We tend to stay up here, like at a very surface level where most schools that I work with, kids will say, or teens will say, well, consent is just about getting or giving permission. But we don't really talk about what makes it difficult to assert yourself. We don't talk about power. We don't talk about race. We don't talk about class. We don't talk about communities that have been marginalized who may find it difficult to speak out because it's been punishable in the past. We don't talk about those kinds of things. And with young people, they need that we don't talk about gender and how that maps to how we navigate consent. Many of us are socialized as pleasers. Some of us are socialized to feel entitled to bodies and time and space. And if we don't lift these things up for young people, it kind of goes unexamined. And so I think having those conversations is really a great thing to start. And those can start from a really young age.
Yeah, I think about Oprah Winfrey's story that she's sharing more now, right? That her parents literally had sex once. That was her, but they really were never parents to her. They never had a relationship. So the beginning of the story can be very impactful, can't it? So,
yeah.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Natasha.
No, I don't mean to interrupt you. Did you want to, no, I mean, I think in terms of models of relationships, I work with a lot of kids and I'll ask them, do you have positive models? And some of them will say yes. And I'll say, do you have also models that you look at and you think, I don't want to ever have a relationship like this? And many of the kids will say, yes, I've seen fighting, I've seen arguing. And I think for parents, it's great to be able to lift up what are behaviors that you hope your child will replicate. What are behaviors they're looking at around them and wanting to model or actually not model. But talking about this is really important because I think the biggest fallacy in this space is that parents will often say, my child's not in a relationship. My child's not engaging in sex or sexuality or decision making. This conversation doesn't apply to them at all. What I can assure you is that young people are developing attitudes, beliefs, and values about relationships and about gender and about power and about communication at a really, really young age. And so to start talking about this in an ongoing way is really helpful.
Absolutely. All right, we have a few minutes together. I'm going to read this last question because I think it's a good one, and then I want to each give you a minute for final thoughts. This is about resources. Parent asks, sometimes I feel like a good way to connect with my child is to watch a TV show or movie together that positively portrays topics such as sexuality and then talk about it. Do you have any recommendations for shows that are appropriate for young teens that cover the topic of sexuality in a positive way? I know that series, Sex Education, is a great one for teens and tweens. Both of you, any ideas or referrals?
Well, I hope you'll use My Body to Love to, approach some of these ideas and talk about them. I also love, Never Have I Ever, which is a South Asian family. And again, all of these like Sex Education, this one, they talk about sexuality, but it's also, I think, the responsibility of the parent to communicate their values and what they take away from it. So that's what makes it so beautiful. So yes.
Thank you, Preeti. Well said. Natasha.
Well, you took mine, although I would say with Sex Education, be careful if you haven't seen it, because for some parents, it might be way over the top. And I would say, I know when I was a few years ago, the first season of Bridgerton, for some reason, a lot of teens that I was working with loved talking about consent and the role of power and silence and pleasure that was featured in that. Truthfully, I think you can take anything in the media space truly as a talking point. You can do that with music, you can do that with shows, and you can use anything really to talk about bodies, image, relationships. We can look at a Hollywood movie and say, isn't it weird that people are having sex after 5 minutes of knowing each other. Like, don't you think that's strange? Nobody's talked about anything else. So I think we can do that in a lot of ways and with a lot of sources.
That's a great thing. It does happen. And Preeti, as our filmmaker and really featured guest today, what are some final words for parents that you want to take away from today?
Talk to your kids. Every opportunity you get, it doesn't have to be one big conversation. I think the idea is to use opportunities to communicate your values, your ideas, and be approachable, be askable. So keep checking your own biases and your own demeanor and what you're bringing in the room, so that you keep that line of communication open. I mean, that's something that I'm constantly, working on and learning as I meet and talk to more people, parents, as well as people working in this space.
That is really great advice, being the askable adult, right? Natasha, any final words from you tonight?
Yes, I'm laughing because oftentimes parents will show up at talks or classes I give, and they'll say, my kid does not want to talk to me. They are just so irritated. Anytime I open my mouth about the subject, they make a face. And I would just say, let's not get invested in immediate results or expect immediate joy that your child is going to want to hear from you. I think a key thing to remember is that it's great to take the long view and really trust that planting seeds will yield fruit. And I get to hear a lot of good stuff from teens that they may not tell their parents, where they'll say, I recognize I didn't want to hear from them, but boy, did I need it. And so I just invite parents to continue leaning into discomfort, leaning into courageous conversations, and don't worry about getting it perfect or getting it right, because we're not trying to gift or giving people this idea, or kids this gift of our perfection is not the way to go. When we can model humility and leaning into uncomfortable conversations, we actually give them the gift of our humanity, and then by extension give them that gift of their own humanity as well. So I really invite us all to step into that space and claim it.
Natasha, that's really lovely. As I say to my daughter, I was raised by a fairly conservative mother. She is a birth doula and a designer. I'm like, you can do better. We can get it. We can pay it forward and do better with the next generation. So, Preeti, thank you so much for your beautiful film. Natasha, thank you for your expertise tonight. Thank you, everybody, for being with us and the wonderful questions and your caring and compassion for this subject. So we're just so glad to have had you all with us tonight. Take care, everybody, and we hope to see you again soon for the next film event coming soon. Thank you, everybody. Good night.
Good night.